by and large, you've got two different streams of production in Australia. You've got legacy companies, of which there are very few, getting these legacy commissions that are heavily funded by the taxpayer, making, by and large, great artistic content, but content that there's a dwindling audience for, versus the creators who are making content that's going out to 5, 10, 15, 20 million people. And people talk about around the water cooler. 2 years ago, a platform calling us up and saying, hey, our audience wants X, Y, and Z. We could have it on platform within 6 months. That was amazing. That's no longer amazing because YouTubers can have something on platform within 2 or 3 weeks. They can follow the zeitgeist of the audience, the audience trends in real time on YouTube and TikTok, and they can amend their content so quickly that it makes us look like dinosaurs. Western kind of dominance over the kind of cultural landscape globally is eroding at a rapid pace through the mobile phone, and it is predominantly being driven by money and culture out of China. We have two choices. We either get in that bandwagon and take their money, or we fight about it and say no, but then we have to go back to having tiny companies with just 2 or 3 people and make films for $500,000.
Steve Jaggi, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You are such a prolific producer. I've long been fascinated by your business model. You have one of Australia's busiest independent production businesses. You work across multiple genres. You do romance, thriller, action, doco. Now I see you moving into micro dramas as well. I'm really curious as to how you've built your business model and also how you're preparing yourself for the future and what you see changing in the industry. Let's start with Jaggi Entertainment, your company. What do you do?
We don't sleep. That's what we do. What I would start off by saying is what we do isn't unique by any stretch of the imagination globally. What we do might be a bit of an outlier in Australia, but we're really just taking models that work in other territories and making minor adjustments to them. In terms of the structure of the studio, we do see ourselves as a studio. We're completely vertically integrated from cradle to grave. So we do development in-house. We have a development team. We have a finance team. We have our own facility in-house we co-finance films with other lenders and series. We obviously have a production arm in-house that oversees physical production. We own a post-production facility, and that facility also now has a VFX arm as well, and distribution, obviously. So we're doing more and more distribution, both international and domestic. I did live in Australia in my late teens. Then I had an opportunity to work abroad. I've worked in Canada, where I was born. I also worked in the UK for almost a decade before returning to Australia as an adult. What we do as a business structurally and the way that we operate is no different to what I saw in Vancouver or I saw companies doing in London, but I didn't see anybody doing here. I think it comes down to a number of kind of cultural differences vis-a-vis, in particular, how content is financed. What I observed when I came back to Australia was an entire ecosystem that was built around government agencies, in particular Screen Australia. At first glance, people would say, Australian companies, a challenge with them is that it's a bunch of filmmakers making the films they want to make. But actually, it's filmmakers bending backwards to make the films that they think the government wants to finance. And the government has no idea what the buyer wants. There's a huge disconnect. I suppose a big distinction between us and kind of our domestic competitors would be that we are incredibly audience focused. So everything we do starts with a conversation as to who is going to watch this and who's going to buy it. Then we kind of work backwards from that. So if there was any sort of secret sauce, and there isn't, but if you said, what is the core distinction with Jaggi Entertainment versus most of their players in the domestic marketplace, it's that we just skip the Screen Australia ecosystem.
How is it that you get what the audience wants? What does that piece of the puzzle look like?
Watch TV, spend hours on TikTok, go to lots of markets. I mean, the reality is when we say what the audience wants, that's also a bit of a misnomer because the audience doesn't know what they want. The audience knows what they want, but the audience isn't the person giving you the money unless you're doing direct to consumer sales. We're looking at who is buying the content from us, whatever that piece of content might be, movie, series, show, whatever. So we're looking at who the buyers are, and the buyers are very vocal as to what they want and what works in their individual territories, especially with streaming. And I think Jaggi Entertainment's growth could really be closely paralleled with the kind of growth of streaming. Like before streaming, we didn't have a lot of success. And then our first kind of big success was a film called Riptide. We're told the first Australian film to trend on Netflix. And that was, a small teen surf movie, but it had like a Disney Channel star and it was shot like a movie, but it was for streaming and we were still experimenting with the formulas. But what streaming did was give platforms a near immediate understanding of what their audience were looking for. And it changed the paradigm because with the advent of streaming, what platforms were looking for, they were looking for production partners who could deliver quickly on demand. All of a sudden, you switched overnight from a system whereby you spend years and years and years developing stories and have all these cultural remits, and then work with a broadcaster, and it'd take 4 years or 3 years from start to finish before you went into production. And streaming just changed that overnight because they would be able to track the audience zeitgeist. It was incumbent on the producer to provide shows and movies that would meet the needs and the desires of the audience in real time, or as close to real time as possible. And that's something that, we're very good at and very adroit at. And I think our legacy competitors, by and large, haven't been able to do that because they've been set up and designed from the ground up to work within an ecosystem that was very dependent on government initiatives and government funding. And that ecosystem cannot move at the pace of the market.
So interesting. So the pace in which you're able to move is one of the things that sets you apart. When you look at YouTube and you look at successful scripted storytellers like Darman moving at a pace and being able to respond to the demands of the buyer and the demands of the audience quickly is certainly one of the keys that he says to his success as well.
100%. And I think the problem with running a company is you're always on quicksand. You're never safe. So, this whole business is changing rapidly. It's kind of like an exponential rate of change within the industry. So we are on this quicksand constantly. And I'm very proud of what we've done. And yes, I think out of any company in Australia, probably I would say we are one of, if not the fastest to adapt and evolve and, deliver to marketplace, which is why we've had these great relationships with global streamers. Our penetration domestically hasn't been as much. That I could talk about that separately and why that is. There's a lot of reasons I think for why that is, but internationally, I think we do really well with international streaming platforms and international broadcasters who love our content and our content really works for them. But I do note, we all know that YouTube has overtaken Netflix as the most watched global platform. There's also talk now that, at some point TikTok will overtake YouTube even. And if you look at where audiences are migrating to, I think if you rewound 2 years ago, the fact that we could deliver a film from, say, a platform calling us up and saying, hey, our audience wants X, Y, and Z, we could have it on platform within 6 months. That was amazing. That's no longer amazing because YouTubers can have something on platform within 2 or 3 weeks. Two things are happening. One, the quality of the kind of micro producers has increased exponentially due to technology, editing software, cameras. I mean, the iPhone 17 Pro, let's call a spade, in most circumstances is as good for the end consumer. Filmmakers will kill me here, but let's just, again, calling a spade. The end consumer, by and large, if you shoot something well on the iPhone 17 Pro, it's as good as shooting on an ARRI Alexa. That is a fact from the point of view of the audience.
So you mentioned about your success internationally versus your success domestically. Can you break that down a little bit more for us and why you think that is the case and what that means for how you produce and how you finance?
I'll temper that by just qualifying that our movies perform extremely well domestically and internationally. If you just look at Love is in the Air on Netflix, or not just our romance movies, but also our YA movies. Every movie that we've done, I'm very proud to say, at least in recent years, has clocked at least 5 million, unique views or more on whatever the main buying platform is. And those stats continue across into Australia. What we found is that we would often get approached. So we produce a film that would be really successful. Every year, we produce multiple films that were like global hits, within the confines of the budget and whatnot. And then we'd have all these Australian broadcasters approach us, like almost every single one, with one exception, come to us year in and year out and say, how are you doing it? We want Jaggi Entertainment content. But then we explain how the sausage is made and how we do it for our global buyers. And then they would just be like, they just couldn't compute it. The system could not. They're looking at the way content is now being made. They're looking at the way that commissioning is being done globally, and they want to do it, but then they would always back away. By and large, they would back away. I think there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of kind of qualifications around the charters of the broadcasters. Is it an Australian story? And you can't make content again at the speed of light or the speed of demand while being, kind of encumbered with all these charters that were set up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And my observation is there is an acute, and I would say it went from acute understanding last year to now a absolute panic as audiences are flocking, not just to streaming platforms, but now flocking to TikTok and verticals and microdramas. You don't have to be a brain scientist to see that there will be no audience left for broadcasters once baby boomers die out. But at the same token, a lot of broadcasters, again, domestically in particular, are frozen. They know what's happening. They will talk to producers and production companies such as ours, they'll see that we're doing it and making content for other buyers as working very well for them. But then the conversation will stop because they can't figure out how to fit it within their very defined. And sometimes that will be because they have a charter. And sometimes that will be because I think every broadcaster in Australia has set up a system where they're expecting the taxpayer to fund their content, right? It's like, well, we're going to put up the smallest license fee possible because Screen Australia will come and do the heavy lifting. But Screen Australia can't get on board what is actually happening in the marketplace. It can't change fast enough. If you think of how quick change is happening, how can a government organization react that quickly? They can't.
Screen Australia are telling us they can only finance about, 25% now of what comes in their door anyway. So they just don't have capacity to fill that gap.
There's a question of should they be financing anything? I mean, there's a whole different philosophical argument. I mean, why is it that the broadcasters feel entitled to having both funded from the federal government to stay alive, and they also expect the federal government and a taxpayer to fund the content? But then you enter into a whole different conversation, which we could go on for hours about, which is the hyperinflation of production costs in Australia. And we've been, I think, one of the effective companies that straddled both. But by and large, you've got two different streams of production in Australia. You've got legacy companies, of which there are very few, getting these legacy commissions that are heavily funded by the taxpayer, making content, by and large, great artistic content, but content that there's a dwindling audience for. You would say, and this is kind of an awful statement to say, but it's who cares content versus the creators who are making content like Darman, like all these other creators that are making content that's going out to 5, 10, 15, 20 million people. And people talk about around the water cooler. But there is just an absolute refusal to acknowledge this other content stream because effectively you have an industry that's hanging on by a thread, and the gatekeepers and the pool of people who are successful in getting that funding gets narrower and narrower. But the fight to keep that ecosystem alive gets more and more competitive and more and more fierce. A great example of that is the debacle around the 40 and 30% changes to the offset a couple of years ago, which I have very strong opinions on, but I won't talk about. And the legacy kind of producers were able to maneuver a setup that really worked for them, but effectively disenfranchised everybody else. Ironically, the taxpayer is propping up a system that is not to their benefit because the very producers that are creating the content the taxpayer wants to see are not being helped to get their content to screen.
So we all know this increase in cost of production has been a massive and unsustainable issue, and you're talking about this two-tier system. My question to you is, how do you create cheaper content? How do we do that?
First, I'd say I always urge people to not think of it as cheaper content. So let me give you an example. When we're making films, I know that one of the criticisms that will be levied at us by legacy producers or crew that have been in the industry for a long time, they'll say, oh, we are going to make really cheap crap. And I'm like, well, you might think so, but our last film had 30 million unique views. And then they'll say, oh, well, yeah, okay, fine. I admit there's an audience for it, but I won't do it because it's too cheap. I'm like, well, our film still costs $3 to $4 million a movie. Like, that's not cheap. When did we get to a point that $2-3 million was not enough to make a movie? That's the problem. If somebody said to me, oh, a film is a cheap film, that for me is a film that's $500,000. That's a cheap movie. And by the way, you can make a good movie for $500,000 if it's done correctly. And that's what verticals are doing so well. The art here in terms of cost control is only photographing what you absolutely have to have on screen and being absolutely, pedantic about what you're actually doing and understanding your audience. But I think the fact that we're at a position right now in Australia where there is an expectation that a movie costs $5 million or more for theatrical, multiple problems here to unpack. First of all, this is one of the few territories where there's still a distinction between theatrical and there shouldn't be. Like, streaming has raised the bar so much now. And if you look at what audiences expect, the byword of quality is a Netflix movie, not a theatrical movie. Again, it's a whole complex conversation around what the audience is expecting, what the audience is not used to. You have a producer offset that differentiates between theatrical and home entertainment. And again, disincentivizes local artists because overseas productions coming to Australia can often end up with more incentives than locally produced content can, and local producers have to jump through all these hoops just to get the incentives that they have to survive. And you can't make any sort of content without the producer offset or the PDVs because the cost of labor is too high. But you then get into all the complexities of the unions and all the wage expectations. And I'm not advocating that people shouldn't get paid for their labor. They should. The issue isn't what people are paid. The issue is how many people are working on the projects. And again, not understanding what the scope of the project is. The new content really taking over the kind of ecosystem, which is predominantly mobile first vertical content. Legacy practitioners, and again, I'm a legacy practitioner, would look at that and be like, this stuff is crap. Like, who's watching this stuff? The fact is, it's being watched by tens of millions of people. Whereas the legacy content that costs all this money and is so beautifully crafted, again, nobody cares about it. And people are not learning the lesson.
Because audience definitions of what quality is have changed.
100%. And that's what we see at Jaggi Entertainment. And we straddle that. And in a way, our problem now is that our content kind of didn't fit with what was traditional 5 years ago. We kind of forged ahead and found the last 5 or 6 years a great deal of success. But now we're being overtaken by people much younger than me. And we have now become the legacy content creator.
Yeah.
We're finding it difficult to compete. And so we're having to relearn the whole business from scratch. Watching some of these young content creators, like, my goodness, this is not slapdash. They really plan it out. And when they go and film, and that's the genius of a lot of these content creators, they are so laser focused on what their audience wants. And they understand this notion that we grew up with, and I'm at the end of this generation. I grew up with this concept of like a 4-quadrant movie. That's over. Nobody gives a shit about that. Now it's about being as laser focused as possible. You want as narrow an audience as possible because everything you do is going global. So even if your piece of content is incredibly narrow, you're still going to have tens of millions of people globally who are going to watch it, and you can monetize it much easier. So you cut out trying to appeal to everybody.
I'd love to hear more about what you're learning at Jaggi Entertainment and how you're future-proofing yourself, and what lessons are in that for the Australian industry, and how we break this addiction to ever increasing costs.
Great question. I mean, it's hard, and we're definitely going through a really rude awakening. Companies that are larger than us, as far as I'm aware, by and large, with 1 or 2 exceptions, are all owned by foreign conglomerates. We're doing 6, 7, 8 movies a year, maybe 30 million a year, give or take, in terms of production expenditure. There are very few companies at our scale or our rate of success in terms of audience engagement. And we probably had a situation maybe a year ago where we really thought we were top of our game and king of the hill. And then literally out of nowhere came these verticals. And all of a sudden now, on a near daily basis, I get packed calls from our buyers, our global buyers, because they're seeing all their audience. And the audience is literally evaporating in front of their eyes. And so they're trying to figure out how to adapt their platforms and how to keep their subscriber base. And it's incumbent on us as the studio producing the content, it's incumbent on us to make suggestions and provide content that can get ahead of what's happening with the kind of mobile first content. A core distinction that provides an absolute advantage to them is that they do not get commissioned. They make the content because the cost of manufacture is so low. They make the content and then monetize it afterwards. So from a pure business point of view, it's like operating a pizza shop, which is a great business, versus, unfortunately, even though I think we're on the cutting edge, we're still in that legacy category where we have to pre-sell our content. We still need the producer offset. We're more adroit at the ecosystem, the streaming ecosystem, than I'd say 90% of our competitors. However, we're still reliant on the ecosystem, even though we've found ways to kind of work through it and use it to our advantage. What we can't compete with is we can't compete at the moment with all these new companies that just see a market opportunity and they go direct to consumer via YouTube or TikTok, and they can make whatever show it is. And to be frank, some of these shows now that are coming from these content creators, like there's a misnomer. These content creators are 1 or 2 teenagers running around. I'm not sure here in Australia. I'm sure there's some outfits, but I've met with some of the outfits that are doing these, in Canada and the US. These are serious companies with dozens of employees. They have lines of credit and they're monetized. These new companies can churn out a new piece of content on a weekly basis at a quality level that the audience is accepting as quality. Whether or not we like it or not is immaterial. The audience likes it, and it is engaging with the audience, and they can follow the production companies, or these micro studios, if you will. They can follow the zeitgeist of the audience and the audience trends in real time on YouTube and TikTok, and they can amend their content so quickly that it makes us look like dinosaurs. When I remember when I met you first a couple of years ago, and I said, we can deliver for you a show in 6 months. I don't think you believe me, but we were doing that. But now 6 months makes me look like a dinosaur, because these new kids are doing it in 4 weeks or less. And again, they're not kids in their basement. They are fully fledged mini studios.
We did an interview with Michael V. Brown, who directs microdramas in LA, and I absolutely got that impression. They are a really sharp outfit, and the way that they understand data as part of story is unbelievable. What's the opportunity for you as a producer and for Australian producers in the microdrama space?
Well, there is a hidden thing that we need to talk about with microdramas that nobody talks about, and I think it is another impediment to Australian legacy producers or Australian producers entering the space. I hate the term mobile first, because what we're seeing now, we are seeing broadcasters, particularly in Europe, coming to us looking for horizontal shows that are effectively microdramas for TV because the audience is now flocking. The audience loves this format. Like, and it's not a new format. It really is telenovelas, right? During the explosion of mobile first content in China, some very smart Chinese producers looked at these telenovelas from Mexico, realized that they work really well in Chinese, and then just like, kind of supercharged them with their 5-minute cliffhangers. But there is a core challenge domestically, which is the politics. And nobody ever talks about the politics. So this, again, will make me know friends on your podcast. But if you look at the explosion which is happening right now for this sort of content, it coincides with the current administration in America. It coincides with a rebound of the conservative movement. And the reason this is important is that there is an audience base. This is important to not get too political in terms of like letting your political leanings jaundice your worldview. Like I'm probably moderately left-wing, but I've had to come to terms with this, and the rest of us as content creators should. During the previous administration, the Biden administration, conservatives were vilified. And the mainstream media, which is the media I would subscribe to, the New York Times, The Economist, the Sydney Morning Herald, absolutely vilified conservatives. So they flocked to an area that they felt comfortable in, which was mobile space. So you now have an environment where essentially the audience base that is mobile first tends to be a more conservative audience base. The audience base that is more traditional media is a more left-leaning audience base. At the moment, like it or not, it doesn't matter what people like or don't like. The reality is that the right side of the spectrum is growing in influence, and people are flocking to that side of the spectrum politically, culturally, and they're driving this change. And it behooves us to understand who our audience is and what they want to watch. And I fear, and I think a big impediment in Australia is a absolute, within the media creation sector, within the sector you and I work, a gigantic bias by content creators who are by and large exclusively on the left. And I would say the vast majority are on the hard left. There is a bias and almost a condescension towards their audience. And until that disappears, we will never, as an industry, effectively engage with the audience, and there will be a further and further disconnect. And the very few channels that are available that will commission or purchase left-leaning content, really, ABC and SBS. And how long will the taxpayer keep funding those channels? And when will those channels start switching what they're looking to do as baby boomers die out and as the voting patterns in this country change? It is a complex pattern and something I'm very interested in. Also, probably because before I went into film, I was in anthropology, so it fascinates me. But I think that understanding who your audience is and understanding audience patterns and audience viewing habits and audience political leanings is incumbent to running a good business. Because if you're not making content that your audience wants to pay for, you're not in business.
Wow. I mean, so much in that. I think these are the tough things that we don't talk about, but, we know the audience is changing. So who would you say your audience are, and how do you get to know that audience?
First of all, Jaggi Entertainment is in and of itself not the kind of direct conduit. Like, we are not a streaming platform. So it's incumbent upon us to understand who our primary partners are. And you just need to go on IMDb or look at our content to see who our primary buyers are. They do shift depending on who the commissioning editors are. But we have, it's safe to say at any given time, we have 2 or 3 principal platforms and broadcasters who are buying from us film after film after film. We're not hard right and we're not hard left. There's a number of global broadcasters and streaming platforms who are looking for that centric content. So what we're doing is we're looking at the platform first. We have the relationships with our platforms that buy a lot of content from us. We're having a very open dialogue with them. Our development team is talking all the time. And obviously different platforms are in different territories, so they also have different leanings. It's just the opening dialogue, the open conversation. And I can't stress enough, when we bring new people into work for us, if they've worked for one of our other, I wouldn't say competitor, but one of the other legacy companies in Australia, we often have to go through a process that takes several months of kind of getting them out of the mindset of being like, well, it's all well and good to love art house films. It's great that you go to these festivals at the Palace Cinema, but those films don't make any money. And those people are not buying movies. So that could be your personal taste, but that should not influence what you're pitching in the development meetings or in the writers' rooms. You should be watching TikTok every day, and we'll have TVs in the office where we're reviewing like TikTok trends. We're watching stuff on YouTube, and I'll tell you a big one for us and to do with influencer culture. We just wrapped a movie for a streaming platform in the US, and it was the first movie we did where the lead number 1 was a social media influencer. Hasn't been announced yet. We'll be announcing it soon. Very big influencer. This platform has changed their entire model. And by and large, all their movies now are going to be headlined by influencers rather than traditional actors. And we were debating this internally, and we're like, and one of our development execs, she went onto Netflix and looked at all the top 10 movies on Netflix. And out of the top 10, don't quote me here, but I think 4 out of 5 movies in the top 5 were influencer driven movies. The change is massive and it's quick and it's coming now. And the reason it's changing, it comes back to the audience. And so what I'd put to you, and this is hard for me, it's hard for all of us content creators, because you have a generation now who are growing up on YouTube and are growing up on short form content and mobile first content, the very definition of what quality is and isn't is entirely subjective. And I warn every producer and every content creator in Australia, do not look down your nose and do not condescend your audience. Because for a lot of people in this country as well, they would feel more comfortable watching it, their preferred influencer who they've now grown up with in a movie or on a piece of content than a legacy actor. And when they see a legacy actor on a legacy platform, they think it's boring or they think it's out of touch. Even the style of acting, the style of delivery, the style of storytelling. Microdramas, of course, are a great example of this in terms of how stories are written. That's changing. But the way that dialogue is being delivered, and I'll give you an example of this, there is a style that influencers and mobile performers, web-based performers, will often deliver content that is more realistic. They call it realistic. We might look at it in a legacy format as being, I don't want to use the word amateur, but there's not as many peaks and troughs. Like it's not as nuanced. It's because when you're making content for TikTok or YouTube, for TikTok in particular, you have to get your message across quickly. There's no subtext. It's very quick. It's very on the nose. And it's a different style of delivery. And you now have an entire audience, I'd say probably 35 and under, give or take, maybe 38 and under, who are now growing up with that, who prefer watching that in their movies than watching the legacy actors who are delivering what technically might be considered to be a better performance. But to a new audience, they don't see it as better. They see it as dated, old. They can't connect with it because the way they're connecting with screens and the way they're connecting with performance has totally changed. Also, because we're making content for global audiences, we have to understand that a lot of people that are watching the content, English is not their first language, which is why subtext and like the meta performance, which I'm a big fan of, has really fallen out of favor, except in the high-end art house and high-end broadcaster area. Because when you're making content that has to work globally, it can't be meta. It can't be too nuanced because a significant portion of your audience doesn't speak English as a first language. I think people have to come to terms with this really quickly. The biggest commissioners out there right now and the biggest pots of money are mostly coming from China or Southeast Asia, but predominantly China. There's a different cultural background. And if you look at mobile first content, especially on TikTok, especially all these mobile first content platforms, they're predominantly Chinese owned companies. And even though it's English language content, they are also taking with them their cultural biases and applying it to the content. And it is influencing the audience as well. Now, there's a whole different conversation around culture and whether the ASIO should be allowing this. And, and America is having a big debate, at the highest levels about this. But essentially what you're seeing in real time is American cultural imperialism, or if you want to be a bit more diplomatic about it, not just American, but Western cultural influence and with the Western kind of dominance over the kind of cultural landscape globally is eroding at a rapid pace through the mobile phone. And it is predominantly being driven by money and culture out of China. We have two choices. We either get in that bandwagon and take their money, or we fight about it and say no, but then we have to slim all our companies right down, go back to having tiny companies with just 2 or 3 people and make films for $500,000. You just have to trace the money.
Do you think direct to consumer has an increasing role for a company like you, whether it's building community or putting up paywalls for your own content?
Absolutely. I think it's a misnomer to think that every company can have their own app because the app-based ecosystem is already bloated. And I think you're going to see consolidation. I mean, the media landscape and consolidation is going to be extreme. Having said that, I'm both encouraged and petrified by the fact that a lot of companies who are smaller and more nimble than ours are monetizing their content on YouTube to a point that they're getting very wealthy. The last trip I did to LA, I caught up with a small, again, mini studio. I think they've got 11, 12 staff making YouTube content, like drama for YouTube. But again, different lengths, different durations, all this sort of stuff. Every car in that parking lot was a $100,000 car. I'll tell you that much. Like the money they're making, we could only dream of over here. And it's not because they're in America, it's because they're selling direct to their consumer. I'm befuddled by it. I'm not fully aware or fully kind of understanding just yet how one makes enough money to prop up an entire company through direct to consumer sales. But there are people who are doing it and they've cracked the algorithm. What I am seeing is that they are making content that is extremely targeted. But to your point, is it the future? Yes. What we're looking at as a company, and we're looking at the next 5 years, we don't even bother now. We used to plan 10 years in the future. We started the company. Now we're planning year by year, and our long-term plan is 5 years because it's changing so rapidly. We're already seeing with the companies that we worked with, like sales companies, distributors that we used to work with, and now we're bringing all that back in-house. With our extended catalog, they're releasing it on YouTube. We've seen films that we've made, foreign distributors cutting it up and reissuing it in vertical for their territory. Now, how that goes with union contracts, I don't know. But you know what? Nobody cares. People just do what they want with it. And you see fans. This is interesting. I know when we made the series Dive Club, that was quite successful for us. Fans would do so many re-edits of the series. Like we had fans completely re-editing the series based on their favorite characters. And when we didn't continue the series, we had fans like using now AI and stuff to kind of continue the journey and whatnot. Unfortunately, we don't get any money from that. So I'd love to see a system whereby the original content creator, actually what will happen is we have to get away again from this arrogance that like it's our film and it's special. When we put a film or a series out there, we need to encourage the wider audience, the wider viewer base to engage with it and recut it and change it and do what they want with it, as long as we can get paid from it. How do we monetize that so that we're getting royalties from that while people are recutting our content and getting it back out there and doing things with it? But I think it's at our own peril if we refuse to engage directly with the consumer.
So are these changes making you rethink your contracting and your long tail and how you monetize in the long term?
Oh, 100%. I mean, we do have another problem in Australia. The problem here is that the union and the producer aren't in cohesion because we have a common enemy. And our common enemy is very simply, at some point, the money will run out and nobody gets paid. But right now, what's happening is the pool of money is shrinking. And rather than thinking and working together to maximize or expand that pool of money, what's happening is the pool of money is shrinking and everyone within the ecosystem, the unions and the guilds, right? Everybody's to blame. Everybody is actually bickering over a smaller and smaller pie.
So where do you think the conversation needs to happen is how we readjust our thinking so that everyone can win in the long term?
100%. We should be encouraging the talent to be selling direct to their fan base. And you're going to enter a whole world of hurt now. I don't want to really talk about actors in particular because there'll be a lot of people who will be bad at me. And it's a lot of feelings around this. This is before we even talk about AI. But, as we're seeing in real time, we knew it was coming, but now we're seeing it. The expectation that your leads be influencers. But, why are we not doing deals with our talent where our talent are selling directly to their audience base and building, what should happen at a union and guild level is a complete just reboot and looking at the ecosystem and a restructure of how we monetize content and how everybody can participate in that monetization. Unfortunately, there are too many vested interests from the old guard and they're clinging on to a system that's dying and they will not let go. And so what's happened is the new content creators have said, F you, they're off now. And to get these new content creators and there's new actors who are non-union, who are all in these verticals. And I'll just touch on verticals for a second there because it's really interesting. A year ago, verticals were a joke and the budgets were so small and 100% they were exploiting people. And, we wouldn't have a bar of it. Nobody in Australia really wanted to make it apart from a few outliers. Now I'm seeing verticals being commissioned for $1 million+ per vertical, massive commissions for legacy companies to make these verticals. And what you're seeing is these actors who have done verticals, that's actually a quick way for them to become stars, to become famous and to monetize. And I've had this conversation now with young actors who say, why would I want to be on a traditional media that goes to a traditional broadcaster where the casting process is horrible, the audition process is horrible, being on set is a horrible experience. And then I get nothing from it and I still have to work a job in a cafe, or I can just say goodbye to that system and I can go into this whole new system doing mobile first content. Okay, last year, the money was crap. The money is getting better, but the volume is there and I can get famous really quickly on Instagram or on TikTok. And I can then start, generating income from that fan base through, other kind of social media opportunities and influencing and all that sort of stuff. So suddenly there's a pathway for the talent to monetize their career. Where through legacy media, that pathway is closed off to all but the lucky 1%.
Let's talk about AI. We know the ground is moving under all of our feet. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities with AI? And how are you stepping into them?
I mean, it embarrasses me to say this, but at the moment we're not stepping into them because, there's so much change in the industry and I'm constantly in a headspin just trying to figure out what to do on a day-to-day basis. If I contemplated AI, I'd have a nervous breakdown. One thing that I have been acutely aware of for some time is that the creative industries, the entertainment industry, whatever you want to call it, we are an adjunct of the IT industry, and now even more so. At some point in our lifetime, and I hope it's 10 years away, but realistically it's probably 2 years away, you will be seeing entire shows generated by AI. It is frightening. It scares the shit out of me. If you ask, like, what am I doing about it? What I'm doing is planning to retire earlier. Honestly, like, what's my exit strategy, just on a personal level? Because as and when AI can do, like, make content that people are happy to pay for and will watch, why would you bother going to all the expense of having real humans? There will always be a desire to have humans acting in things. I mean, I still go and watch Shakespeare in the Park. When I was in London a few trips ago, I went to the Globe and that was pretty cool. But that's, not going to be sustainable for everyone. That's going to be for 1% of the community, maybe 5% if you're lucky. I'm as scared as everybody else is. And yeah, we're trying to figure it out, but I don't know.
Given how forward thinking you are, Steve, I find that really interesting, your take on AI.
We're definitely experimenting with it internally for all sorts of boring things like helping with payroll and budgeting and this sort of stuff. On a personal level, I only have so much brain capacity, but I have no doubt that AI will make a massive difference across the board to every facet of what we do.
So if you were speaking directly to a screen creator who was starting out today and someone who wanted to build a business, what advice would you give them?
Don't do it.
Or do it in the new media landscape?
It's difficult, isn't it? If I can go back and give myself advice as a child, it would have been, like, follow your dreams, but have a pursuit that is, do something that cannot be. There are certain things you can do in life that are not going to be changed as quickly or affected as quickly by all the changes that are happening right now. I appreciate the allure of cinema. I mean, I'm enamored by it. Despite everything I say and preach, last night on my TV, I watched Out of Africa, which I really enjoyed. And my favorite film is Dances with Wolves or Lawrence of Arabia. I love watching those kind of films. Now, will I ever make a film like that? Unfortunately, highly unlikely. But I think it's okay to be enamored by that and that sort of cinema. And cinema is an art. But in terms of being able to have a sustainable career where you're actually earning money, in Australia, it's definitely new media. And I think that the practitioners who are working in this space that I'm seeing achieve a level of success that allows them to live comfortably, i.e. buy a house, own a car, and afford a family. What they have in common, like, they have teams, they're not solo operators, but the lead person is in almost every way, shape, or form an influencer. You have to be a personality. And there are examples of that here in Australia. There's a number of filmmakers who have started off in a mobile first environment, then transitioned into the larger screen. They're probably making more money on the small screen than they are on a big screen, but they're able to go back and forth. And what I've noticed, what they all have in common, is they built themselves as a brand. When I was at university, when I was going through film school, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, we were told that we shouldn't be personalities. The examples of people who are successful at the moment that I'm seeing, they start on a small screen. They build themselves up to be a personality because initially they are the person on screen. They go from hosting something to making drama on the small screen, and then they graduate to the big screen.
So personal brand in front of camera is becoming more and more important, you think?
It's paramount, yeah.
So interesting to talk to you, Steve. Really provocative and insightful, and I appreciate your time. I always finish the podcast asking people for a big idea. So if you could change or offer up one thing about the Australian screen industry to make it better for us all, what would that be?
To be provocative once more and get more hate mail, I think what we're really missing in Australia is any sort of leadership. And I think at the moment you have a situation where people in the private sector look to government for leadership. There are a number of government bodies at the moment that are doing, I think, really great work on both a federal and state level without singling out individual people, but you have a situation right now where nobody wants to take leadership. There needs to be a singular vision of how we can, forge a pathway towards sustainability that everybody gets on board and everybody has buy-in. And at the moment, you don't have that. It's an inexorable slide to extinction domestically. Somebody has to stick their flag in the sand and say, guys, this is not working. This is not sustainable. Broadcasters don't want to pay commissions anymore. That's a fact. The productions are too big. If you have an ecosystem where broadcasters are not prepared to pay commissions of millions of dollars, you cannot have TV shows that cost millions of dollars an episode. It's as simple as that. You cannot have movies that cost $5 million for a movie when the maximum you can recoup at the box office is a couple $100,000. It is not sustainable, but nobody has the courage to say that. And until somebody says that, number one, this is not sustainable. And number two, takes charge in terms of building towards a consensus as to what the pathway forward is, I don't see how we can get out of this train crash. That's the change I'd love to see.
Thanks so much for your time, Steve.
Thank you.
We Interrupt This broadcast is recorded on the unceded lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we acknowledge them as the traditional custodians and first storytellers of these regions. Always was, always will be.